Morning, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds.
Turn this on and make it into
Oh, sorry.
That was me.
Before we start, I'd like to just make a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we're gathered and are grateful to live and work and play on the traditional and ancestral unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Today's Grand Round, I erroneously thought was brought to us by the Addictions Medicine Service. Turns out it's not. It's Dr. Ryan Lowe is an allergy immunologist and is going to speak today on hypersensitivity to dope.
That's right. Thanks. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you kindly for the introduction, Dr. Casson. I'm Ryan Lowe. I am an allergist immunologist. To become an allergist immunologist, you could either take one of two paths. You can either be an internist first, or you can be a pediatrician first. And I took the internal medicine route, so I trained here, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to many of you. Okay. Perfect. Hopefully that's showing up well. So today we're talking about cannabis hypersensitivity. So it's not something that people often hear about. So I wanted to take this opportunity to be a bit of an advocacy platform to share with you something that you may be seeing even on a regular basis without really recognizing what's going on. It's not going to be a very big house-like mystery type of rounds, but hopefully it'll still be something that's interesting to you. Some disclosures. I bet there's no money in cannabis. I don't think this is relevant. Okay, here are the objectives. So I want to go over a few things. So one, I want to explain to you what plant are we actually dealing with? How does this all come together? Where you would see cannabis and how people might be able to be exposed to cannabis. I want to talk about what symptoms would show up in somebody with cannabis allergy and how it depends on how they got exposed. And I want to dive a little bit more onto what allergens are actually in cannabis that cause these reactions and why it matters, how it might confer cross-reactivity to other things in life. So we'll start with a brief case. Again, this is more just food for thought to really kind of bring some of the concepts throughout the talk together. So let's say you have a 25-year-old man who showed up in the emergency and you were consulted for admission, let's say on ICU. He was previously well. He might have a background history of asthma. He had a salad at Freshie, and then within a matter of minutes, he started having mouth itchiness, nausea, urticaria all throughout, and dyspnea. Paramedics were called. He was brought to the emergency where he needed multiple doses of epinephrine. And let's say, despite all that, he still needed to be intubated. And you're now at a point where you're seeing a patient. That's about all the history you have. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the anaphylaxis management. That's not really the focus of the talk. So let's say you managed them and stabilized them. What do we have to deal with before we discharge this patient when he is better, hopefully? And on the element of your history, some food for thought. Well, how might your social history help make this diagnosis of what exactly caused his allergy? And if I throw in a couple of twists, let's say he's got a history of seasonal allergies, how does this affect your diagnosis? And if I then tell you, let's say, hey, when he eats some fruits like peaches or tomatoes, he gets itchy mouth, how does that change your diagnosis? And does it matter whether that tomato is cooked or whether it's not? So, food for thought. Okay, here are a bunch of random pictures, or seemingly random pictures. Question is, what do they have in common? So, the right side is probably something that's more easily recognizable. That's a plant with a flower and some dried herbal preparations. In the middle are a bunch of food seeds. And on the left there is a hat and a rope. Exactly. So these things all come from the same plant. What plant are we dealing with? We're dealing with something of the genus Cannabis. It's a lot of fancy botany words, but it means it's a plant that has a year-round cycle, or has a 1-year cycle. It's an herb, it flowers, and it pollinates, and it has, often the last word means both male and female parts on the plant. Okay. So this is the plant we're dealing with today. let's break that down a little bit more and look at different parts of the plant and how people might become exposed to it. So one, when the flower blooms and it makes a seed, that's what hemp seed is. Okay? Hemp seed is relevant because it's often now used as an alternative food for a protein source. So you can see that it can get shelled and become known as hemp hearts, and that's often kind of seen in alternative foods. But it can also be pressed and made into an oil. Sorry, the font is pretty small there. It could be made into a meat alternative, and so on and so forth. So something that you might be exposed to without really even knowing that's from the cannabis plant. If we were to go down and look at the stem of the plant, it's quite fibrous. And so it's often used dried up and used for fabric. So it may be for rope, it may be for art canvas, it may be for hats. The leaf isn't really used for much, but the leaf is what everybody really recognizes. So it's a serrated edge leaf and often used as an icon for the cannabis plant. And then at the tip of the plant, we have the flowers. So a couple things to highlight about the flowers. They come in clusters. Let's see if my mouse shows up. They come in clusters at the end of a plant like this. They have these, well, so we refer to the cluster of flowers as a bud. And this is what's often dried up and made into a smoked preparation for recreational or medicinal use. And on here, you'll find that there are these bracts which cover up the part of the flower that becomes the seed. But this is relevant only because, well, not only, but in part because you can see it's covered with all these fuzzy things. These are the trichomes, there's no R there, typo. This is where all the fun chemicals are made. So that's why most people are smoking the flowers. So what are the fun chemicals I'm talking about? Well, it's a class of chemicals that are a combination of the terpene-like substance and the phenol. So therefore, it's called the terpenophenolic compounds. There are a whole bunch of them, but the two biggest ones, the ones that are made the most by these plants and the most famous ones are THC and CBD. This is what people often focus on when they think about the psychoactive properties and the medicinal properties of the cannabis plant. That said, when we talk about allergies, usually we're looking at proteins and how the immune system recognizes proteins, and which is a scale, a magnitude off in size. And so this is not really the focus of allergy specifically. You may also hear the word terpenes. These are similarly chemicals made also in the trichomes that are more for the scent and of the plant. So people who smoke cannabis might be interested in those. Okay, so as we were briefly saying, the flowers are often used for recreational and medicinal use, and some terminology that's associated with it, really. The flower is dried up. That's often referred to as marijuana, although marijuana really takes different definitions in different places. You can shake it and get all that trichome and good stuff off, and then that's called keef. You might press that into that, and that's hash. You can make oil out of it, so on and so forth. So fundamentally, most of the recreational stuff is to do with the flower part of the plant. So those are some of the ways that people might become exposed to the cannabis plant. Some general terminology. In lay terms, usually when people refer to hemp, they're referring to cannabis plants that have been very selected for seed or fibrous use. They tend to have very low THC content, so they're not used for recreational use. And when people refer to marijuana as opposed to hemp, they might be looking at cannabis plants that are more selected specifically for the flowers and the psychoactive properties. But really, fundamentally, it's still the same plant. Okay. And in common usage, and even in legal usage, sometimes the plant is separated by the THC content, and they're called different strains and chemotypes, so on and so forth. But in allergy, that's not really the separation. And you might have heard the words sativa, indica, ruderalis before. And before I really looked into this, I had no idea, what's the difference between all these things. And so I wanted take a bit of a detour, very briefly touch on history and tell you guys where all this came from. And it boils down to whether you think this is all one species or not. And it's still a controversial topic within the field of botany and cannabis. Some people think it's monotypic, and so it's all sativa. Others think there might be multiple species. So sativa, where does the word come from? Well, 1753, way back now, when Carl Linnaeus, the same guy who did the whole kind of kingdom phylum stuff, described a bunch of different plants in his species planetarum and included cannabis in there. And he named it Cannabis sativa. And then there's a capital L for his last name because he named it. And got a photo here. The species he used, or sorry, the sample he used was likely from Northern Europe, from Sweden, apparently. And as you can see here, it's very lanky. There's not a lot of budding. There's not a lot of density in it. And so affectionately, others have said that he was looking at rope and not dope. And so this is probably more of the hemp or fibrous type of sample that he was looking at. And so that's where Cannabis sativa originally matched to, okay? Fibrous plants. About 30 or so years later, this other gentleman, Lamarck, was in Asia and really in India when he found a plant sample that seemed to be very similar to cannabis. But he said that, hey, this one has a very strong odor. You smoke it and you get high. And it looks a lot more dense. So the sample that he used, this is from the Paris herbarium, probably looked more like this one. So it was a lot more dense, a lot more flowery stuff on it. And he said, well, this seems to be a slightly different species. I'm going to name it something different. So he called it, because it was found in India, Cannabis indica. And the lamb part is again from his name because he named it. So that's where the words sativa and indica came from. And if you really, really look back, botanists think that before all this exploration happened and all this stuff got moved around, about a millennium ago, this is probably the distribution of the cannabis plant. That in the northern areas, there was a lot more agricultural use for fibers. And so they were more fiber predominant. And in the southern areas, it was more of a recreational use or ritualistic use. And so they valued the psychoactive properties. And so they selected for the indica variant. So that's where those words came from. That said, in the many generations since, there has been a lot of mixing with each other. And it's important to highlight that this plant, whether it would be the sativa or the indica one, can reproduce with each other. So there has been a lot of hybridization that has since spawned from there. And chances are a cannabis sample that you get from the store now is going to be some mixture of everything. So what about the word ruderalis? Where did that come from? Well, fast forward a couple centuries now, this gentleman, Januszki, found a type of hybrid of cannabis that he found to be very moderately tall, branchy, and may have wild type seeds. So, botanist things. And he thinks that this is slightly different, so he coined it Cannabis ruderalis. Those of you who are very familiar with cannabis terminology might notice that, hey, well, this doesn't sound like the ruderalis I know at all. But that's really where the name came from. And then about 7 or so years later, this other gentleman traveling in Afghanistan then found a specific type of cannabis plant that's very, very short, doesn't have branches, broad leaves. He actually called this something different. He called it Cannabis sativa varia spontanea. So how did all this kind of get jumbled together? Well, 1974, this professor at Harvard published a big paper and reported his belief and his understanding of how cannabis is separated out. And he was obviously an expert witness in many different legal matters. And so that really stuck, long story short. So he called it 3 different types, the Cannabis sativa, indica, and ruderalis. He called the indica ones broad leaflet, somewhat short, the high psychoactive properties. You may realize that, hey, this doesn't sound like the indica that was originally coined by Lamarck, but That's what it is. That's what stuck. So this probably was more the Afghanistan variant of sativa. And then the ruderalis, he kind of combined the two findings and called these extremely short, mini, unbranched ones ruderalis. And from there, everything kind of took off. And so this is a drawing in the 1980s that essentially used that particular classification. Sativa on the left, indica in the middle, ruderalis on the right. Now, okay, that's handy dandy. Now we have some names for different groups. Is there actually any basis to why they're separated out that way? Well, some people will try to look at genetics to really differentiate this out. And so Hillig in 2005 looked at the variations in enzymes that can come and tried to cluster different species into different groups and see if there is a genetic correlation. And this is a very busy graph, and I don't claim to understand Bondi studies too well, but essentially he found, he looked at 11 different enzyme variants, combined them into two main axes of variation. So essentially the closer plants are, the more alike they are in genetics. And he used the different classification groups at the time to see how well it maps everything. And we can see that this proposed Cannabis indica ruderalis in 1974 doesn't really classify things very well. Instead, maybe the original Lamarck definition of there being the sativa hemp stuff and then this indica smoke stuff seem to fit a little bit better, but it does miss quite a bit of other ones. And so he proposed maybe it's actually, there is in fact several species, but it misappropriately or inappropriately typed. And then one more genetic one before we move on. But in 2015, there's a local UBC group that made the news by further looking at SNPs. And so really looking at the genetics to see if there really is any difference in everything. They found one axis, there's one group of SNPs that can really well classify whether a plant is medicinal use, so marijuana, or fibrous use, hemp, and really broke that down. They then took a bunch of commercially available samples, and I apologize, these are all the common names. So you see, you maybe not see, but you see Master Kush, you see Ada Tundra, and all these fancy names that people often look at when they buy cannabis. And long story short, their reported sativa content was all over the place. What people called sativa, what people called indica, ruderalis was all over the place. And so commercial labels really are not very good. And so popular usage, sativa, indica, ruderalis has really taken off in a totally different direction. People might associate sativa with more psychoactive properties, indica more sedative properties. But the take-home point is that when we look at this scientifically, they're all really the same plant, all hybridized together, not very good labels. Okay, so that was a bit of a botany detour. Let's come back to allergy. Why do we care? Why do we care about what I'm talking about in this presentation? And I want to try to frame it that way because many of you are not allergists, but I still think this is going to be somewhat relevant to you, and you're going to see this even without knowing it. One, the hemp seeds and the food products are really all over the place now, especially in Vancouver, where there's a big culture of healthy foods. You will see this. Two, this is the Canadian Cannabis Survey that gets done every year by Health Canada. And we can see that in the group of, so overall is kind of this light blue line, about 25% of patients are actively using cannabis in the last 12 months. So 1 in 4 of your patients will have exposure to cannabis. And depending on the age group, maybe even as high as 50%. So very ubiquitous. Now, cannabis and its associated adverse reactions is a very, very, very big topic. And I don't claim to be an expert on kind of the other stuff like the hyperemesis syndrome and so on and so forth. There is a very good publication by Health Canada that looks specifically at breaking it down a little bit more. Oh, it sounds like somebody might have unmuted. If you don't mind just muting for me.
Yeah, we have to spread about the.
That's good. Okay, cool. So this is a good reference for anybody who really wants to look at, and it's very comprehensive. They look at the evidence and they report it all. But my point is today we're going to focus on allergic reactions. And allergic reactions to me is when there's the body's immune system is actually inappropriately recognizing the allergens and causing an associated response. We know that cannabis has been reported to cause type 1 and type 4 reactions. And many of you might be staring at me, oh, what do you mean by type 1, type 4? It goes back to the gel and Kuhn stuff. I have it on the next slide. The type 4 one is really the T cell activated stuff. It's when people get contact dermatitis. So they touch it and within kind of a few days, usually lasting a few weeks, they might get a rash in that specific area. That's very specific. I didn't talk too much about it today, so we're going to focus mostly on the type 1. Okay. And it's important to note that it seems to really depend on how somebody got exposed to cannabis. And the severity can range from, oh, I'm just a little bit bothered to I could die from this. So this is the gel and Coombs again. So apologies for the low definition, but essentially type 1 ones are when it's IgE mediated. And as a brief review, this happens when the body's immune system sees something that they're not supposed to be allergic to, but recognizes it as an allergen. So that's step 1 there. Over a matter of a couple of weeks, the adaptive immune system activates. The body makes immunoglobulins that shift towards IgE. It gets mounted on these mast cells. And so when the mast cells see the allergen with the IgE, they blow up and cause features of anaphylaxis. Okay. What's anaphylaxis? Many of you know. But I do want to put in a plug. There's a World Allergy Organization publication in 2020 that gives its perhaps newer definition of anaphylaxis that I think most allergists are using, and not so much the NIAID one from 2006. And so I think it'd be a good idea to familiarize with this one. It's relatively straightforward, graphically speaking, or graphically represented. Either somebody has exposure to a potential allergen, has hives plus one other system, or they've been exposed to an allergen and suddenly have trouble breathing or low blood pressure. Kind of that's how it boils down. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit into the different body parts and how it can present. I've got case reports of most of them. So the airway can get affected when somebody gets exposure through the respiratory system. First, we talk about the upper airway. So we're talking about nose, maybe even eyes, larynx, pharynx, that sort of thing. And so there have been case reports where people have essentially developed hay fever-like symptoms with exposure to the cannabis. Again, it's a pollinating plant. For example, in this case report, there was a 27-year-old lady in Spain with springtime allergy and never been recreationally exposed to cannabis, seemingly no other exposures. And when they took cannabis samples, distilled it, and did allergy testing to it, seems like she's allergic to the pollen extract. So one presentation that we don't always think about when we think about cannabis exposure. This 1971 study down here really was the first ever case report of somebody being allergic to cannabis. And in it, it describes a 29-year-old woman who hasn't really been exposed to cannabis before. She doesn't smoke. She might have pollen allergy in the background, but may have been passively exposed to cannabis smoke from others around her. But on the first time she smoked, she then developed nasal and pharyngeal pruritus, nasal congestion, trouble breathing, wheezing, suggestive of an allergic reaction. Now, some of you might say, well, is it really the cannabis? Well, she smoked it again and had similar symptoms. And then back then, it was very crude, but they took cannabis, they skin pricked her and then 10 other controls, 5 of them using cannabis, 5 of them don't use cannabis. She was the only one that had positive skin testing to the cannabis. So this all kind of came together and they suggest that, hey, people who smoke cannabis can have this type of allergic reaction to it. Okay? So that's the upper airway. Now, what about lower airway? Think about the lungs. Well, it seems like patients can actually develop asthma from cannabis allergy. In this particular study, they looked at 168 patients with asthma selected from a European registry. And they did a lot of things, but they actually also did a bronchial challenge with a cannabis extract. So they took cannabis, they made different concentrations of it, essentially did a provocation challenge. And 30% of patients in this group had worsening of their asthma and their FEV1 with exposure to cannabis. In this particular population, they also did allergy testing, and about 30 to 50% of this population had sensitization to cannabis. They didn't report whether it fully overlaps with the bronchial challenge, but we know that cannabis can cause asthma attacks. And this isn't a theoretical thing in Europe. This made the news in 2022 when there was the first reported death in the US of occupational exposure in a cannabis plant due to asthma status asthmaticus. So this was a particular case. Factory worker doesn't smoke cannabis, was previously evaluated for asthma for whatever reason, and had one point in 2016 a pulmonary function test that was normal. They worked in this factory, and then as they got shifted towards a job that had a lot of exposure to flowers, their symptoms got worse and had an episode of status asthmaticus and died. So unfortunately, this isn't a case where they were able to do allergy testing afterwards, but given the story, it seemed like this is definitely something that's relevant. Okay, asthma. So what about even more serious stuff? Anaphylaxis. Can it happen? The answer is yes. How can it happen? Well, it seems like multiple different exposures can still do it. So in this particular case report, it reported two different children, a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old, who has never smoked cannabis themselves, but had anaphylaxis while being outside and being exposed to somebody else who smoked. Now, of course, case reports should be open to criticism, but they did so far as to do allergy testing on this, and it seems like these patients are sensitized to cannabis. And so, at least in theory, it should be possible for somebody to develop anaphylaxis just from smelling the cannabis. Well, what if somebody's actually actively smoking it? Well, that can unfortunately cause a problem. So, oh yeah, this is the case report with the 14 and 13-year-old child. I do want to show this briefly because we'll see some of this stuff later on. But essentially, they took gel, put a bunch of cannabis proteins kind of in the gel, took patient samples from this case and from controls, and then blotted it. And when IgE binds to this cannabis stuff, it then precipitates and forms that dark band. And so we can see that in both of these patients, there seems to be a big band around here that corresponds to attaching to a particular cannabis protein. This is I think, rabbit control where they spiked it with anti-lipid transfer protein, which is a potential allergen to it. And it also similarly had a band there, whereas a control did not have a band there. So that's the basis that they think that somebody is actually allergic to cannabis. Won't go too much into this, but there was a case where somebody might have had food-dependent exercise-induced anaphylaxis after a smoke preparation of cannabis, ate some wheat, and then went exercising. And so this is a rare phenomenon where people have anaphylaxis. It could be food allergy caused, but only is triggered when there are cofactors such as exercising, and in this case, perhaps cannabis exposure. So that's cannabis, that's smoking. We know smoking can maybe cause anaphylaxis. What about other routes of exposure? IV. Most people don't inject themselves with cannabis, but some people have chosen to. And there have been case reports where people died from it. So in this particular example, a lady infused a cannabis solution into a plastic bag and injected it. And then she was found to be dead after. And then they measured on autopsy the serum tryptase level. And sorry, not on autopsy, it's when they found her and evaluated. Autopsy might be a little bit too late. But the tryptase is a marker that is released by mast cells along with things like histamine and kinase and stuff, but it's a little bit longer lasting. And so, and the tryptase was found to be very high. So the chance that she died from anaphylaxis.
That's pretty rare.
It's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. I know I'm kind of almost equally presenting the different presentations, but yes, by far most people have the rhinitis, maybe the asthma or the contact reactions. That said, more importantly, anaphylaxis can happen with oral consumption of cannabis. This actually happens. Okay? Yes, there have been reports of anaphylaxis with the cannabis flower preparations, like making a tea. But perhaps more importantly, there have been many reports of people having anaphylaxis after eating hemp seeds. So this is the first one, 2003, 44-year-old gentleman, background history of asthma, maybe some seasonal allergies, some recreational cannabis use. And interestingly, he could smoke cannabis okay and have no symptoms. In fact, against medical advice, he smoked cannabis again after his reaction and still had no symptoms, but had this big episode with hemp. So perhaps there's a little bit of difference in the protein content within these different parts of cannabis. He apparently ate a hemp seed crusted catfish and calamari. They did some testing, including an oral challenge to the calamari. He was fine. So it's not calamari. And allergy testing to the hemp seed and different forms of hemp showed that he was, in fact, allergic. So they did the allergy testing. And again, that's a common thing to do, but they did electrophoresis, had a gel, and again, identified IgE binding to a specific around 10-ish kilodalton allergen there. Okay. So that's something definitely to watch out for if somebody presents with anaphylaxis to the emergency department. Okay, and perhaps most commonly, people can get urticaria where they touch the cannabis sample. A very common history I get is, hey, when I roll my cannabis, my hands get very itchy. Or if I accidentally touch my eye or touch the area on my face, I get very itchy. People can get localized urticaria.
Have you had any like food preparation ones?
Brownies, for whatever reason, don't seem to cause much reaction, and I don't know why.
The marijuana butter.
I haven't really seen it, and when I look through the literature, I haven't seen an anaphylaxis episode to the food
No
from the
anaphylaxis
butter.
from baking.
But maybe, maybe it breaks it down. But then you would think the smoking breaks it down too.
Yeah.
I do want to highlight briefly with this case that it doesn't have to be somebody who enjoys using cannabis. This, for example, was a work-related exposure, and we were kind of briefly touched on that with the asthma one. But for example, in this early case study, 29-year-old woman who works in a forensic lab started out with no symptoms on touching cannabis, but after work about a year and a half, started having a rash on the forearms every time she touched the cannabis. So this could be an occupational hazard. Okay, so very briefly, well, how do people become allergic? We kind of briefly talked about this. We have to remember that people don't tend to be born allergic to anything. They have to become sensitized through making IgE. We talked about recreational use. There's medicinal use, smoking, consumption, occupational exposure. But one thing I wanted to quickly point out is that people can be exposed by doing nothing. They can be exposed because of pollens. There isn't a lot of information about pollen counts of cannabis in different areas, but there is one big one in Nebraska. And in Nebraska, because even way back over 100 years ago, there were already big plants cultivating a lot of hemp-related products there. And it's also a wild species there. And so they looked at the cannabis pollen numbers. And at one point in peak, it accounted for over 30% of the pollens in the air. And it was specifically spiking in the summer, so between June to July and August or so. They took it a step further, and they took 120 or so patients with hay fever or asthma, and they did allergy testing to common pollens that might be causing this, and 61% of them were sensitized to the cannabis pollen. Definitely is a relevant thing. So it goes back to the point there, hey, how often does this actually happen? And the short answer is we don't really know because nobody really studied it, right? We have very small epidemiological studies where patients are randomly sampled in an allergist office and asked, hey, do you have problems with cannabis smoking? Do you have symptoms that could be associated with allergy? And one in Colorado, one in Toronto, up to 50% of active users, 24% of previous users said they had some sort of symptoms. But it's hard to know, is this an actual allergic reaction or is this irritant related or anything else?
And we're not really looking for it. So if we see someone that comes to the ER with, urticaria or asthma attack, we're not primed to ask them about exposure to cannabis.
Absolutely.
Right?
Could very well be underreported because it's underrecognized. And we'll briefly touch on this with the investigations, but there really is no easy commercial publicly available investigation yet. Okay, so we took a big detour. Coming back to our original case here, you have somebody who presents to the emergency essentially with anaphylaxis. You admit them to ICU and then maybe to CTU. What are some things that I would probably do before the patient gets discharged? Again, one thing I want to advocate for is that a serum tryptase level is very helpful to us allergists when we do the comprehensive consult. It's something that's released by the mast cells when they granulate, and so should be elevated in anaphylaxis. It peaks at around 2 or 3 hours, and then it really drops off after the reaction. And so if you see somebody in Emerge and they just had a reaction, please send for the serum tryptase. Chances are you won't be able to get a hold of the allergist, so we won't really know what they're allergic to before they're discharged. But let's say you found that there's a label of the salad in their bag or something. There's all this stuff in it, including hemp seeds. I would say, hey, avoid all this stuff, refer to an allergist. They're due for their testing, make sure they have an EpiPen. Nothing too fancy there. Okay. So now we dive a little bit more on kind of more of the allergist focused stuff. If anybody has any questions or feel like this is too boring, let me know. I'll go ahead. So what exactly are we actually dealing with that's causing the allergy? So us allergists, we really want to know, hey, what protein are we actually dealing with here? So there have been many attempts to really characterize this since 2010. And generally the study protocol would be get a bunch of patients with allergy to it, analyze what the IgE binds to, then try to analyze what that specific thing is. And so in North America, for example, in this particular study, we see that they did exactly that. And they actually took this patient serum and tried to attach it to different parts of the cannabis plant. And they found that the band pattern in the roots is very different from the leaves and the flowers and the buds. So perhaps there is, in fact, some difference in the protein pattern in different parts of the plant. They identified a couple, one's called rubisco, one's called oxygen. You'll see this later in the naming, but not something really to memorize. They did something similar in Europe. And in Europe was when they really identified the one major allergen that seems to be associated with most of the cannabis reactions. And that's a 10-ish kilodalton band that correlates to something called a non-specific lipid transfer protein. The allergist nomenclature for kind of the different proteins that can cause allergy is to take a Latin name of the plant or whatever it is, get three letters from the first part, one letter from the next part, and start numbering it. So you'll see Canis 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. That's what they're all different proteins. But this is what we know now and is reported in the IUIS for allergens from cannabis. Why does it matter? Well, why do we need to care about these proteins? Because many of these proteins are highly conserved in different plants, different foods. And so being allergic to one of these proteins may mean that you then get cross reactivity with other plants and foods. And so clinically, that's very relevant. The one specific one to talk about is CAN-S3. Oh yeah, this is a brief slide. Okay, so is this something that's relevant? Well, does it actually happen? When people get allergic to environmental stuff, do they actually get allergic to other things? Well, yes. One of the most common ones is pollen food allergy syndrome, where people are allergic to tree pollen, birch pollen specifically. They get springtime allergies, and then every time they eat apples, peaches, pears, they get itchy mouth. Very, very common phenomena. I'm sure you know somebody that has this. But this is just to illustrate a point that this can, in fact, happen. With cannabis, the story went, hey, around 2007, 2008, a bunch of people started noticing reactions to tomatoes and peaches. And in this study, for example, they were studying tomatoes, in fact, allergy to tomatoes. It was a 2-year study. They started noticing that many of their patients had reactions to cannabis. And so they dug into it a little bit better. They grouped the different patients with or without reactions to cannabis. And they found that mainly the people that do have this band corresponding to the lipid transfer protein, at the 10 kilodaltons. Later on, this other study took a bunch of people with allergy to pollens and other plants, so they went the other end, start from that end, grouped them into cannabis allergic, non-cannabis allergic, and looked at their sensitization patterns, and again showed that the ones who are cannabis allergic almost invariably had some sort of allergy to a lipid transfer protein. And not the cannabis one, but one from peach, one from hazelnut. So there is some cross-reactivity to lipid transfer proteins from other plants as well. So this has now been affectionately named the cannabis fruit vegetable syndrome. Too bad this kind of showed up kind of small, but you can maybe see here that with the CAN-S3, the other cross-reactivities could be things like tomatoes, tobacco, banana, latex, peach. So in theory, and in rare practice, when people become allergic to cannabis, they can also have a bunch of allergic reactions to all these other things. Important to also note that this specific protein is heat stable. So cooking the food or processing it does not break it down. And when it gets to the stomach, it doesn't get broken down from the acid. And so people can actually get anaphylaxis, severe allergic reactions from it, as opposed to the common peach apple one with birch, which is heat labile. There have been, this is from 2023, there have been a little bit more focus on looking into the hemp allergens. And long story short, there seems to be a slight difference in the component that's in the hemp. So maybe we're dealing with different allergens. Okay, we'll quickly talk about investigations and treatment because there really isn't too much. And then we'll wrap up. So those of you who haven't had exposure to allergy, we usually investigate whether somebody is allergic by exposing them to whatever they might be allergic to and see if there's an allergic reaction. We do that by pricking their skin with it, essentially. And if the mast cells at that area recognize it, they degranulate, you get a mosquito bite. Alternatively, we can also order, for most common things, a lab test looking at IgE that's specifically directed to one particular allergen. For cannabis, we don't have any commercially available tests right now, like zero. And so what most allergists do would be something called a prick test. They get patients to bring in a cannabis sample, or they have a secret stash somewhere. They prick the cannabis, and then they prick the patient's skin and see what happens. It is good, it works, but the main drawback is you don't know what this cannabis sample has in it. You don't know how it differs from a different strain one, and you don't know if it's contaminated with mold or anything else. Well, is there any literature guidance on what investigations we should be doing? So yes, there is a consensus statement from the Canadian, American, and European allergy associations, and they say, well, this is what you should consider. So if you have a patient with history, think about testing. Test to the cannabis stuff, so that's the prick test we talked about, or a bunch of other tests that's not actually available. And if you do find it's positive, it'd be great if you can then further test to the different allergens that are involved, called component resolved diagnosis, to really confirm whether they're allergic. Long story short, we don't have any of this right now, unfortunately, but it is available on a research basis in Europe. They went so far as to look into the different tests and their different sensitivity specificities. They looked at a bunch of tests and found that skin prick testing to an extract that is specifically spiked with CAN-S3 seems to work the best. So let's say we now diagnose Aaron with hemp seed allergy. What can we do? The textbook answer is strict avoidance. That's it. Case closed, unfortunately. If they have allergic runny nose, treat that. If they have asthma, treat that. If they have anaphylaxis, make them carry an EpiPen. But as of the official answer at this time is that's really all we have. That said, though, it didn't stop people in literature from trying different stuff. Us allergists, when we find that somebody's allergic to something in the environment, we can do something called immunotherapy. We give somebody what they're allergic to so their body slowly gets used to it, and perhaps they become less allergic. We promote a more Treg pathway rather than a IgE Th2 pathway. So one case, or a couple cases for hemp since 1930s. For cannabis, there's only been one. In India, they published a protocol, but nobody really knows what extract they use. So possibility down the road. And then omalizumab is an anti-IgE antibody, often seen in asthma or chronic hives. There was one case report where a police officer kept getting anaphylaxis at work because of cannabis exposure. Gave them omalizumab for asthma, and they stopped having anaphylaxis. So perhaps this works. Very, very crude. We don't know exactly whether it's actually anaphylaxis, whether it's the asthma, and so on and so forth, but maybe future reactions. So, okay, wrapping up. How might a social history help your diagnosis of cannabis allergy? Well, if you know their occupation, perhaps there's a higher risk of exposure. If they know their recreational use, medical use history, we know their exposure. Seasonal allergies, perhaps this could be the cross-reactivity with the different allergens, and then the fruits we kind of briefly talked about. So in summary, hopefully we met the objectives of the talk. We talked a bit about what cannabis is. We talked a bit about how allergy presents. We talked about what is actually in it as an allergen. This is a graphical summary, I guess, from a big consensus statement, highlighting some of the things we talked about. And then I'm a new dad, so I've been told putting in baby pics will make things better. So this is the closest picture I have of my daughter Alice with her hand up. So anybody have any questions? Happy to answer anything about cannabis allergy, about allergy field in general, about how to reach allergists, that sort of thing.
Brian, do you think that much like peanut allergies, should the public be informed that hemp is in, or is hemp added to food that we're not aware of?
Yes. So in a way, I think it'd be nice to have advocacy as part of the treatment and direction of cannabis allergy going forward. Right now, in product labels, we have to list the most common allergens there. And that would be things like peanuts, tree nuts, so on and so forth. I think we do have to draw a balance as to, hey, what the government mandates to be put on as a potential allergen based on how common something is. I don't know if we have enough data at this point in terms of epidemiology about hemp seed and cannabis allergy to really know how often something like this occurs. I think it'd be great if we are able to list all the allergens, but I don't know if we have enough to really push for that right now.
Well, it's just that you said 1 in 4 people are using
cannabis,
but that's not industrial exposure or other exposures. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. You're right. I think the next step though is that I know, hey, among people who are exposed to cannabis, how many of them develop the anaphylaxis to hemp seed? How many of them develop all these other presentations? And so once we have that, if it does turn out to be something very common, and I recognize this in a more frequent fashion, I do think that'll be a good next step.
But the exposure to hemp, but not as an ingestion, so contact is probably pretty common because
totally.
hemp is in a lot of
Fabric,
fabrics. And like even when I think back to like when I was a kid and I went to elementary school, when you climb on all those ropes and stuff, those were usually made out of hemp as well.
Totally. I think the next step is from that perspective. Yes, we are exposed to fabric and hemp all the time. The connection in my mind is how often do the proteins get released and how often we become sensitized to hemp through that. So I think that'd be a nice next research direction to really know how frequently people.
Any questions from the audience? Any questions from people on Zoom? If not, apologies that I thought this was an addictions talk. I didn't look to see the presenter, but that was very helpful and very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everybody for being here. And then if anybody wants the slides, I'm happy to share them by email.